I thought I'd begin by asking with a question that lots of people used to ask me back in the day, before I had grays on my chin, which is that, people expect historians to be old and mature and very serious and very dignified and so on. You are dignified, I'm sure, but you're also very young. How did you get into history, and how did your first book happen, which has been a sensational hit since it was published 11 months ago?
Thanks so much, Manu. Thank you all for being here on this lovely afternoon. Manu and I both get asked this question very often. I think we actually just had an interaction with a journalist in the speaker's lounge just now, and the first question that Manu was asked was, are young people interested in history? And I would just say to anybody who asks that question to look at the audience here, because I just see so many faces similar to ours. And I think this idea that young people aren't interested or shouldn't really be the ones who talk about history is a little outdated. I think that so much of India's politics, which of course we'll get to later in this conversation, so much of India's politics are driven really by young people's interest in history. And very often when they go online, they're not able to find good quality information, so they end up reading stuff from, let's say, WhatsApp or social media or so on. And for me, I'm lucky, I suppose, to have come of age at a time when Facebook was just picking up. It wasn't as much of a thing when I got into college. And like a lot of young Indians, I was curious about the past. But when I went online, I really didn't find much about India's history. So I ended up playing games about ancient Greece and ancient Rome instead. And that got me thinking, because every time I was curious about, let's say, Julius Caesar or Alexander the Great, there'd be a bajillion, really well-researched, well-written books that I could read about them. But if I wanted to read about Ashoka or Chandragupta Maurya, I would really not find a lot of information. I would find scholarly works. I'd find works like Romila Thappas, and those would be interesting to me, but not interesting to most other young people. And so, when it became clear to me that history was something I wanted to be doing for years and years to come, I realized that there's a lot of potential for telling stories, historical stories, to young people in the way that young people resonate with. That isn't too centered on the highly critical, nuanced, scholarly arguments, but it takes the essence of those and then distills them into interesting stories about people like you and me. And that's very much Manu's approach as well. When I first read The Ivory Throne and then looked at a draft of Rebel Sultans before it came out, that was very much the vibe as well, because instead of reading history as a story of all these great and glorious kings who lived in such and such dates that you have to learn in the textbooks and had these and these administrative measures that you have to mug up and then vomit onto your board exam answer sheet, I remember when I read Rebel Sultans and Manu talked about this ruler of Vijayanagara who wrote a compilation of ways in which to have oral sex. And I was like, that's the kind of history that I can actually, that I can really believe in, because it's full of people who aren't caricatures, who aren't there to teach you some great moral lesson, but who are living lives just like you and me are. And the idea of bringing these lives to people like all of you was something that tremendously excites me. And that's really why I do what I do. And I think that just as Manu is here 6-7 years after your first book, Manu.
That's why I said I'm ancient.
But that's what I find so interesting, is that history is always unfolding, because 6 or 7 years from now, I will be sitting where Manu is sitting, probably talking to a historian younger than I am now, and asking them why they write history the way they do. There's this tendency to think about history as something that's in the past, but history is something that's always unfolding all around us. It might seem surprising to us to think about it now, but someday somebody will write a history of the 21st century. And when that history is written, I at least want them to say that, look, let's say that we live in a corporate dystopia 100 years from now, or at least there were people 100 years before us who tried to do the right thing and tried to tell interesting new histories.
Wonderful. You've also worked a lot with technology and new media. For example, before you finished your book, you'd already done 2 podcasts. Whereas in some ways, my route has been more old-fashioned, which is go to the archives, get all the material, write a book, then you write the other book. And I'm not so far engaged with technology. Do you think did that inform the way you ended up writing your book? The fact that you had already dealt with a different audience on a different medium and then decided to come and write a book?
Yeah, exactly. That's a great question, and I think that is absolutely the case. So, for those of you who've listened, I used to host a podcast called Echoes of India before I became a full-time writer, which obviously left me time to do nothing else. But being a podcaster, right, I wanted to tell interesting critical histories in 20 to 25 minute segments. And when you're doing a podcast, when you're using a purely audio format, that gives you limitations that you have to work with that also make you more creatively impelled to do interesting things. So let me give you an example. My podcast begins with Alexander's invasion of India, something that all of us have heard about, but it explores it from the Indian perspective. So it begins with me putting you in the shoes of King Porus, looking at the Greek army on the other side of the river. And to bring that scene to life, I sat down with the audio engineers I was working with and said, look, how can we make this something that is going to grab people's attention from the get-go? And they came back to me with an edited recording where they put in the sound of rain and a thunderstorm. So you're listening to me telling you the story of this king, and you're hearing rain and thunder that he may have heard on that fateful night. And we made the podcast, and then later on somebody was telling me about how they listened to it, and so they were cutting vegetables while listening to the podcast. And there's a scene where, so Alexander is fighting the king, and the king is making his last stand, and then his bodyguards blow conch shells. Now, that's a very uniquely Indian sound, it's something that's so culturally ingrained into all of our minds. And he said that because he used to listen to a lot of English language podcasts, but English language podcasts tend to be made in the West, and they aren't exactly going to put conch shells into their podcasts. And he told me that when he first heard a conch shell in an English language podcast talking about India's history, he almost cut off his finger because he was so surprised by that. And I think that when I sat down to write my book as well, this idea that the way that you really bring people into history is by evoking their imaginations and calling upon their senses, right? So talk about the sounds that they would have heard. So I begin in my book by talking about this battle between a South Indian and North Indian emperor. And rather than talking about the kings from the outset, I say that the forest is in complete turmoil because 2 great armies have come to fight. And imagine the sounds, right? So there would have been distant drums beating, there would have been elephants fleeing, monkeys screaming, and there would have been horns and trumpets and the smell of strange perfumes in the air, right? And that's such an effective way to tap into the audience's imaginations, get them to really imagine and transport them into the time that I'm talking about. And that's something that I think has really come from podcasting. But I suppose I could really bounce the same question back to you, Manu, in terms of being more of a quote-unquote traditional history writer in the sense of approaching it from the archives. How do you still come up with these interesting stories and characters? How do you really write about people as people rather than being carried away by the sometimes dry tone of archival and scholarly material?
There's a philosophical question in this about what constitutes an archive, right? When we think of the word archive, we typically think some library, some dusty place where there are lots of files that are kept together, and that's the archive. And that's true. I did end up working in the Kerala State Archives, the National Archives in Delhi, in London, and they were places where there were files, there were papers, there were documents you had to handle. But an archive is more than that. An archive can also be an archive of oral history. Achal Malhotra, I think, had a session yesterday, and she is an oral historian. She collects history based on the memories people have formed, based on objects that they've carried with them during a cataclysmic event like partition, and that tells you a story of its own. So that is an oral archive. Archives exist in the sense of our literary output. We're at the Kerala Literature Festival. Every novel that's produced now is a source in future to understand what this period was about. When a K.R. Meera, Benjamin, Harish, etc. write, the themes they pick out, the topics they write about, the voice that they project, all of that in future becomes part of the historical archive in understanding in 2022 or 23, what were the issues, what were the subjects that animated people and made them curious, made them interested. What they wanted to write about, and so on and so forth. So that is an archive. Film is an archive. Newspapers have their own interesting stuff to throw up. I remember when I was doing my fourth book called False Allies, Ravi Verma is a very small connecting thread in the book. It's about 5 princely states, and I use the artist as a connecting thread because he went to all of these states. And in the course of the research, I came across some interesting press articles featuring his mother-in-law and his father-in-law and a murder case in 1862. Now, clearly the record had been wiped because, his sisters-in-law were the Ranis of Travancore and all of that. None of his biographies talked about this. None of his official narratives spoke about this. But it turned out his father-in-law was convicted in a murder case. And the story went, according to the early press reports, that his mother-in-law was having an affair with a servant called Madhavan. Husband found out. Husband did not like that his wife was having an affair. He picked up a jackfruit, beat Madhavan on the stomach with a jackfruit and killed him in what was called the jackfruit murder of 1862. Now it's interesting, right? None of the official sources have it. But because it was such a bizarre, sensational event in 1862, it was carried in the newspapers and it made its way all the way to London, where Queen Victoria read about it, I imagine. And that becomes a source to understand something all his biographers have missed, because it's buried in the newspaper archives, not in the official letters and records and that kind of stuff. Those have been sanitized already. In Kerala, we had the famous case of Kuriyadatta Datri. Now, the Kuriyadatta Datri case is about this Brahmin, Nambudri woman who was found to be committing adultery with some 65, 64 men. Now, the interesting thing is, there were women who had committed adultery before, there were women who committed adultery after. What made the Kuriyadatta Datri case interesting was that it was covered in the press. And there was almost a weekly, monthly coverage of what was happening in her trial, with lines like she replied like a barrister when she was sort of counter-interrogating people and all of that. That is an archive in its own source. Poetry. You take the poetry of Annamacharya, Kshetraya, all of those Telugu poets of the early modern period. The way they deal with God tells you something about how Indian religion evolved. It's not just the Vedas and Puranas. It's about how people took the ideas of religion and actually experienced and expressed religion. So in some of these padams you find God is treated as a customer on his way to a courtesan. And when God arrives, the courtesan says, I saw you yesterday with that other one. Don't come to my door, get lost. Or you haven't paid me for the last time you came here. What are you doing here today? First you give me my money. That's the kind of dialogue you're having with God. That is the way religion is expressed. So all of these sources constitute an archive. And they're all archives in their own right. Every bit of cinema that is made, every novel that is written, every photograph that's taken, everything becomes a source of information for future historians to play with. So for that reason, if you use diverse sources from architecture, art, buildings, material, oral memory, all of that, you don't necessarily need to make much of an effort to make history interesting. History is interesting because you're getting such diverse perspectives on the same subject that you're going to get the glorified version, you're going to get the subaltern version, you're going to get the naughty version, you're going to get the sexy version. All of these together allow you to put the story into one piece, into a narrative, and that's what makes it interesting.
Okay, so it's almost like you're walking into a room that the inhabitants have just walked out, so you can't talk to them, you can't ask them what they think. But you can look around the room, you can look at perhaps the remains of their journal entries, you can look at what they are wearing, you can look at their jewelry, you can look at the way their bed is carved, or the way or the paintings on their walls, something like that. And you can try to reconstruct who they were as people. And that's what I find so fascinating about them, is that the story that seems to emerge again and again from every historical source that both of us have seen is that it's the same people, right? This was one tremendously moving account I'd like to share with you. I was reading this book called Abraham's Luggage. I forget the name of the author, but it's basically about the Jews of Egypt in the 12th century and how they used to trade with the west coast of India. And it's based around one singular scrap of paper upon which a Jewish merchant called Abraham scribbled down a list of things that he was carrying to India. And that in itself might not seem that interesting. Yeah, it's a list of luggage. I mean, everybody does that. But what was really striking to me was that this wasn't a blank piece of paper that Abraham was writing on. So Abraham seems to have been the kind of person who was very careful about buying paper and where he spent his money, and so this was a receipt for a customer that he had written, and on the blank margins is where he was scribbling his information about his luggage. And it seems that at some point he realized that he was in a hurry, he was running out of time. So we can tell from the depth of the pen marks on the paper that when he started he was sitting at a desk, and then because he was in a hurry, he got up, he was holding it in his hand, and he was just walking around his room scribbling down what remained of his luggage. And I don't know why, but that moved me to tears, because all of a sudden this person who I have no idea who he was, what really was going on in his mind, but he was a person just like me, with habits just like me. He was walking around, suddenly have this perfect glimpse into his life, and I'm able to see this moment where he's just about to set off on a journey, he's in a bit of a rush. And that has really stayed with me, is that all of these people, the great, the glamorous, the sexy, the less glamorous, the people who are just living life day to day like you and me, are fundamentally occupying the same kind of emotional worlds as you and me. When they were crossing the seas, did they stop and look up at the stars? Were they humbled and awed by that experience? They must have been, just like we are. And of course, there's also there's another tremendously moving account. So there's an Arab merchant, I think, from the 12th or 13th century, who has not been home in 10 years. And the only trace that survives of him in the historical record, the only evidence we have of his having lived and died and loved and breathed, is a letter that he's sending back to his wife. We don't have the original letter that she sent him. And the letter says that, look, I have not been home for 10 years and I don't know when I will be back, but if you want a divorce, I will grant it. I just want you to know that in all these years that I've been away from home, my heart has never stopped longing for you. And that's a feeling that I'm sure all of us have felt in some way, and once you move aside all the glamour, all the jewelry, the perfumes, all the glamorous aspects of history, at the end of the day you're left with the story of people like you and me. And that's why, as you said, Manu, I don't know why people think that history is boring at all. History is a story of lives, and what is not interesting about human lives.
At a certain point a few decades ago, it became very unfashionable to talk about human experiences in history, because the feeling was that we reduce historical events to great men, the occasional great woman, mostly great men in those days. They didn't really look at the women much, and gave the impression that, these great men achieved things, and that was considered a very old-fashioned way of doing history. Then the focus moved to processes, economic forces, social forces, etc., and start looking at the bigger picture, not as at individuals itself. But while you were talking, I was thinking about how all of history is ultimately made by human society, and all of human society is made by human beings. And this rich emotional experience is a very important element in that. Take something like partition. You can look at this is an example I typically give, because you can look at the facts and the figures, you can look at the statistics, you can look at these many millions of people displaced, these many women violated, such violence, these many people killed, etc., etc. But then you read Manto's short stories, like the famous one, Kholdo, where the woman's been abducted and gang raped. That's what brings out the same event. It's fiction, but it brings out the emotional turmoil and the emotional torture that this involved. These people weren't just people or numbers and statistics moving across a border. They were lived experiences in what was happening. And that's why I think it's important to bring some of that emotion back into history by humanizing these historical figures. And it helps, we're in Kerala, so in Tiruvadhamkur, Padmanabha Dasas, that was the official line, right? We are God's regents on earth, we are so pious, Rama Rama is all we chant all day long. And then occasionally we have to deal with the British very unwillingly. That's the official narrative. If you read the official idea of the king's schedule, the king wakes up in the morning, he has his prayers, then he goes to the temple, he comes back, he only works, then he goes to the temple again in the evening. Very picture-perfect routine, right? And then you come across a record in the archives, such as from the early 1800s, 1810 or so, no, before that, 1805 or so, where the British resident is hosting a banquet, and the Raja of Travancore comes to attend. So in those days, because the Rajas were high caste Hindus, they can't eat with the white people. That makes you lose caste. So they would sit there with a lemon in their hand, because lemon absorbs all the impurity of being around white people. And therefore you sit there with the lemon while the white man eats what he wants to eat. Now what happens is, at the table there's also a nice bottle of imported brandy. And Raja's like, I want to taste this, it seems very exciting. Now obviously he's Padmanabhadasa, he can't drink brandy openly, his courtiers, his friends, his relatives, all the court Brahmins are around him. So apparently the record says that as he was leaving, in those days they used to wear these long Persian robes. As he was leaving, he sort of whisks the bottle and puts it into his robe very coolly and tells the resident, I'll go home and then I'll have this in the privacy of my bedroom where nobody can judge me. Now, suddenly humanizes this figure, right? Somebody who seems to occupy 1810, 1805, some different planet, different era. What was he? Some king, people you can't relate to. I can relate to somebody who wants to have a bit of a brandy without his family judging him. Entirely human, entirely realistic, right? That is what brings the life and the pulse into history. Humanizing history, talking about the characters, talking about the people, talking about what made their lives rich and complex, just as our lives are rich and complex and sometimes have contradictions. None of us are perfect. They weren't perfect in the past either.
There's the Archaeological Survey of India, and I understand this probably sounds like a boring tangent, but bear with me. So the Archaeological Survey of India has this magnificent volume on Chola murals. And they have this painting of Shiva as Tripurantaka, the destroyer of the three cities. And so obviously Shiva is angry, right? He's furious and he's destroying these three demonic cities. And what really struck me about that painting is that Shiva is angry, but he doesn't have his brows furrowed. He's not glaring like this. Instead, he's doing something like this. He's got his eyes wide open. And it's very similar to how anger is depicted if you look at, religious movies from like the 1950s, 1960s, or even if you were to look at modern day Kathakali or Bharatanatyam performances, very often anger is depicted with these wide open eyes. And I was very struck because it is the same emotion, of course, but their body language is so different. Just a little bit of a tangent, doesn't really have any relevance here, but I just thought it was an interesting thing to talk about.
No, but it's an interesting thing on art and how art can tell us not only about history, but also how attitudes change. I was talking to a friend the other day about how, there's that standard Bengali representation of Kali, where she's stepping on Shiva, I think, and her tongue is out. And what happens is, in the traditional narrative, this is Kali. She's a bloodthirsty goddess. It represents that element of her. Now, apparently in the Victorian era, there was a degree of embarrassment about this tongue-out woman, and, stepping on Shiva and all of that. So some people came up with the story that, she was walking and she happened to trip on Shiva, and that's when she's like, ayyo, and then that's how her tongue came out. And it's funny, but it's also a way of telling you that society gets uncomfortable as times change and reinterprets the same things in different ways. Something that had an original meaning becomes something very different in the Victorian period. And the same is true at different periods in time as well. So art also becomes an interesting source material because it tells you so much about us. It's not a reflection so much on people in the past, it's a reflection on us and what we make of the present and how we are uncomfortable with certain things, and therefore we reinterpret and reclothe and recloak things in ways that are more comfortable for us.
That's something I actually come across very often because I work on a period that's well before Manu's, right? So I work on the period from 600 to 1100, so at least 1,000 years before us. And what really strikes me is that partially because of the process that Manu was describing, where Indians are suddenly aware that, okay, so the West is judging us from this different moral compass. So there's this urge to go back and kind of reinterpret everything in India's past from this Western perspective. So I was telling this to Will as well yesterday, there's this tendency to really orientalize the way that we see India, right? So India has always been this very mystic, sanskari land because white people won't respect us otherwise because they come from a particular Protestant morality, and we must depict ourselves as having those same qualities. That's how Hinduism really is now thought of as a single religion in a way that it really wasn't historically. But this actually brings me to a couple of minor tangents. So the same thing about Kali and her tongue sticking out. Have any of you heard the Rolling Stones? The Rolling Stones, the band. So the logo of the Rolling Stones, arguably one of the most influential rock groups of the 20th century, is a mouth with its tongue sticking out, which is meant to represent the mouth of Kali. It's supposed to be this interesting, transgressive, feminist statement. The other thing I want to talk about, and this perhaps is much more relevant to my area of research, is the presence of erotic sculptures on Indian temples. And I actually have a personal anecdote directly connected to this, because when I was much younger, and I hope this isn't being live streamed, because if my mom listens to it, I'll be in a great deal of trouble. But when I was younger, my parents used to take me to Tirupati like practically every year. And this one time when we were waiting in line, to go and see the god, I happened to see an erotic sculpture. And I was old enough to know what it meant, but I was curious to see what my mom thought of it. So I asked her, "Mom, what is this?" And she's like, "Oh, it's just there for sex education, because in those times, this is how people used to get sex education." Going back and having studied erotic art a little more, I know that it's not meant to be sex education, but it comes from this culture that was not ashamed of sex at all and thought it was auspicious to represent it in temples. And that is so different from our own moralistic qualms about sex and how sex should be something that's confined to heterosexual couples, that must be confined to the space of a married bedroom, rather than something that was far more open as it used to be historically. And this doesn't really have a purpose as to why I brought this up. I just thought it would be interesting.
No, but I was reading a book by Simon Sebag Montefiore called the World of Family History. I think that's what it's called. And I interviewed him for the book. He basically traces world history through the unit of family. Great families, powerful families across the world, across continents. And certain patterns emerge. And, sometimes it's about how power affects family dynamics. The moment you have a family and then you inject power into the family takes a back seat, power politics takes the forefront. The other thing was sexuality, because sexuality was also linked to legitimacy. So you have cases where a king's mother is ambitious and she's trying to meddle in politics. King says, okay, let me just send a new lover to her. At least he'll distract her so I can focus on my job. There's no, oh my God, how can you discuss this kind of an attitude? It's very practical. She's poking her nose in my business. I need to distract her somehow. That's one thing. The other thing is also legitimacy. One of the reasons sexuality mattered in those times was also your next king, the next ruler. You had to be absolutely certain he or she was of the right blood. But more often than not, chances are the bloodlines often broke. And that's just, again, human behavior. It's nothing that's different from our time. It's nothing, again, I shouldn't bring in a family anecdote, but my grandmother's a very vivid storyteller, no censoring. She tells me about one of her uncles who was a very good-looking man, extremely good-looking. And she says that, this man, by the time he was 16, 17, he had a reputation for being very good-looking. He used to play the veena, he used to sing, so full-on package, as it were. And what happens is, in those days, only our ancestral home had a column. So a lot of families nearby used to come to our place to have a bath. Now, the route to the column was very direct, because the public also came there. But apparently there were a bunch of women, including some very prominent families, who would take a long route to come via the house. And my grandma was like, "Ingere kanana," that is to look at her uncle, because he was such a good-looking, Apollo of a figure. And of course he milked it. He littered the place with illegitimate children. And my grandmother actually asked him, saying, "Isn't this bad behavior? How can you, father children all over the village like this?" And he said, "I am a man of principles. I have never had an affair with an unmarried woman." Which is to say, he never ruined any woman's life. He only went around with women who already had husbands and therefore whose reputations wouldn't be tarnished. Now, this is happening in the early 20th century, Valyammavan and all of that, which is great uncle. Normally, if you look and speak very seriously in an ordinary setting, people say Valyamma, very serious people, very, very, you have to be very respectful of them. But everything I have seen, thanks to my grandmother, they were just as naughty, they were just as interesting, they were just as capable of being human. That was just how it was. Now project that backwards into history, and suddenly a lot of this weight of censoring, the weight of morality that we sometimes force on our shoulders, all of that sort of vanishes a bit, because you realize, hold on, why are we taking ourselves so seriously when throughout history the pattern remains the same? Human beings are humans, they make mistakes, they do naughty things, and that's fine.
I don't know how, but this brings up another question, which is, we've talked so much about people who leave trace in the historical record, right? The people whose footprints you can discern in history. But what about the people who don't get to leave those footprints? What about those who kind of fall between the cracks, as it were, who don't leave these traces? In your work, how do you retain that awareness of people who don't get to do that?
The thing is, again, it depends on where you're looking, right? So if I were to write something based purely on what is in the written files, and this is something I repeatedly emphasize, writing, firstly, was an elite preoccupation. Literacy was an elite activity and an elite preoccupation. As a result of which, any written record you're looking at reflects the perspective of usually a certain class, and a class that is economically forward, politically forward, and close to seats of power. That's what it reflects. Often it reflects the official narrative of those who are in charge. But then there's a lot of history that is recorded orally. To give you one example, which I discussed in an interview the other day, there was a Travancore king called Martanda Varma. Now, there is the official narrative, the Sanskrit Bala Martanda Vijaya. Firstly, ask yourself a question, why is it written in Sanskrit? Because this is the king's advertisement on a pan-Indian level of who he wants India to think he is. So the Bala Martanda Vijaya is basically a play in which, in Sanskrit, everything Martanda Varma does, all the violence, all the battles, all the conquests, is because God has ordered him. God has come to him, given him a vision and said, you must repair my temple, conquer the entire Indian subcontinent, bring back all the wealth, and you have to repair my temple. So he is this, he's waiting to renounce the world. And then God appears and tells him to do this. That is why he fights all these battles. That's his official narrative. At the same time, you have in what is Kanyakumari district, the Villipattugal. Villipattu is these bow songs in the Nadar community, where he's the opposite of this divine, holy, renunciant kind of figure. He's somebody who's cunning, he's treacherous, he murders people in cold blood, he lusts after women, he runs away from battle, because without treachery he can't win battles. That's the image you get in the Nadar community's Villipattu. Now the Nadar, these were not written down, these were sung. These were kept alive in that community orally, but they are a counter perspective to the same historical figure. Then you look at what the Dutch have said about him. He defeated the Dutch, but the Dutch also, all these colonial powers maintained a big intelligence network in Indian states. So they knew what was happening, they knew which places he had plundered, where he was going, what illness he had. Once they had a meeting with him, they've described what he was wearing. So you get a completely different perspective of him from there. Then you go to his official capital, Padmanabhapuram, where the buildings itself are supposed to represent his kingly self-image. So there's one tower-like structure in Padmanabhapuram, where at the bottom is the treasury. Then there's a bedroom that the king used to use on a normal daily basis. Then there's a bedroom which the king used on sacred occasions. Above that is a room where there is the presence of the divine. Padmanabha Swami is considered to be there. I was given access into that room. So there's a bed, there's an eternal lamp, a lamp that's not allowed to go out, and lots of mural paintings. And they let you in with a police guard and all that so that you don't ruin anything over there. And there's a state sword. It's a way of representing the kingdom itself. The treasury at the bottom represents the worldly, materialistic, economic base of the kingdom. The king's everyday bedroom reflects his role as an active, functional king. The spiritual bedroom, where he segregates himself when there are holy occasions, sacred dates, etc., that represents his role as God's divine servant, and there's God on top. In one building, he's projecting his kingly self-image. The same if you look at the Srirangapatnam murals of Tipu Sultan. He's projecting the image he wants you to remember him by in those paintings at his summer palace. So it's by putting together all these elements that you're able to reconstruct the past. And people on the ground who were not recorded in written history often exist in oral history. They exist in song, they exist in lore, they exist in mythology. In the Padmanabha Swami temple, the world's richest temple, they say 100,000 rupees worth of, lakh crores worth of jewels and gems there. There are two stories of how the temple originated. One says Vilvamangalam Swamiyar was sitting and praying, and then that was somewhere in North Kerala. And then one little child appears and starts annoying him, and he gives the child a little whack and says, get lost. And the child says, if you now want to see me, I'll be in Anantankada, and the child vanishes. That's when he realizes, oh my God, this was Mahavishnu in the form of a child. And then he goes all the way to South Kerala looking for this place called Anantankada, where he runs into a woman. She is breastfeeding her child, and the child is, cranky or crying or something. So she smacks the child and she says, if you keep crying, I'll throw you into Anantankada. Appa Vilvamangalam Swamiyar says, then you must tell me where this Anantankada is. And then that's how he finds out the place, and he meets the boy, and the temple is established there. That is one story. There's another story. In the other story, there's a Pulaya community woman from a Dalit community who's sitting there and working in the field. She comes across a spot where she finds a divine-looking baby. She takes the baby, breastfeeds the baby herself, seats it under a tree, and she goes back to work. When she comes back, she sees a big cobra or five-headed serpent protecting the child, and she realizes this is a divine child, and worship starts there. The king, the others, etc. come and build a temple there much later. it's telling you something, right? One is the official narrative of the temple's origin, a slightly Brahminized narrative. The other narrative is the real, perhaps, story of this originally being a tribal grove. From a tribal grove, it became a slightly bigger temple. Then kings and elites came in. It became popular. Suddenly, things started changing. So, Padmanabha Swami served his food in a cherata, which is a coconut shell. Now, the coconut shell is still used, but it's made of gold. Because the temple's trajectory, its narrative itself has changed. But then even that golden cherata is a reflection of the very modest, humble, grounded origins of the temple in the Pulaya community possibly, in a tribal grove, somewhere in the forest, a kada means forest, before it became the Padmanabha Swami temple that we now associate with royalty and kings and so on. So the narrative exists. It's just that most of us don't end up looking for those narratives. We are so fixated with the written word that we forget that there's an entire world of orality out there which has a lot to offer, which we haven't tapped as much as we ought to. Absolutely.
That's absolutely fantastic, Manu. And I do have a few potential tangents that we could take this on, but I just want to do a quick time check. How are we?
We've got another 10 minutes.
10 minutes, okay. So the thing that really struck me is this idea that the oral narratives are already out there, and perhaps this was true 100 years ago or 150 years ago, but I'm wondering also in today's India, when there's this tendency really to try and enforce the idea there's always only been one history of India, right? It's this endless succession of these great idealistic kings, and these questions of caste, oppression, of land being seized, of deities being appropriated are very often left by the wayside. And there's also another tendency to establish these singular registers of languages. So if you look even at Malayalam, for example, Malayalam actually has a number of regional varieties, yet the variety that is used by the state is a classicized register with a standard notation that only came into practice very recently. And as a result of urbanization, as people give up traditional occupations, livelihoods, move to the cities, as traditional occupations where people like bards, for example, who would sing the songs of particular communities, as those no longer become feasible, as their children, very rightfully of course, move to the cities to gentrify, these stories are lost by the wayside. And this kind of absence of a counter narrative very often leads to the dominant narrative, this idea that history is a story of kings becoming more and more commonplace, more and more deeply entrenched. Not really a question, really, just an observation. And I suppose that really leads me to another theme that we wanted to discuss, which is what really is the role of the historian? If this is the state of the research, if this is the state of the materials that survives, and especially given the kind of political environment we live in today, I believe that a week or two ago, the Prime Minister went out and said that historians have been feeding India a kind of biased narrative, and it's time to, quote-unquote, correct that. There's a very clear implication that the job of the historian is to make people feel proud about history. So we can take this two ways. I suppose the first thing to explore is really, have historians created this bias? Have historians created an inferiority complex? And secondly, is it really the historian's job to create pride? And this concept of pride itself, where does it really come from? Why is it important to be proud of the past?
I've said this, so often. I hope if people, heard me at other talks, they won't get bored. But this whole idea of bias, right? No historian is fully unbiased because we are creatures of our time. We are, right now, for example, we are two men who have a certain privilege because we are men. We are comfortable in the English language. All of these things affect the way we look at the world, and they end up having some influence on the kind of topics we write about, the kind of books we do. The first thing is all serious historians acknowledge that there is a degree of subjectivity, there's a degree of bias which is unconscious. Like we have no idea that this is there, but it's true, it's there. But the thing is, training enables you to try and minimize that bias and try and be as objective as possible. So there is no, this quest for the unbiased historian is always going to be a bit of a flop. Because there's never going to be an unbiased historian. History is about debate, it is about argument, it is about coming up with more convincing explanations for the past based on new evidence as and when it emerges. So it's constantly evolving as a subject. And historians are also therefore evolving. So certain topics, the way I would have dealt with it in my first book is not how I would have dealt with it in my fourth book, because I myself have changed over a period of 7 years. My writing has evolved, the material has changed, etc., etc. So that's the question of bias. The other thing is whether it's the historian's job to flatter or not. Now, here I think we fall into between two stools, because firstly there is history and then there is memory. Memory is where emotions come in at a public level. Now, we are the Indian nation. Think of the soldiers dying at the border. It's emotionality. It's about a glue trying to bind us together. In order to create an emotional community. Now, you're from Telangana?
Originally from Vizag in Andhra.
Okay. And I'm from Kerala, but I grew up in Maharashtra, etc. There are people from Kashmir to Kanyakumari. How do you create a gel for people to feel like they belong to one nation? You have to come up with a narrative. This emotional narrative is the national narrative. We were oppressed by the British, then we came together, we had this grand fight against the colonial powers. Gandhiji sort of helmed the movement, we kicked them out, and we got onto this glorious path of democracy. All nations have grand narratives like this, which are emotional narratives. Every community has it. Different caste communities will remember historical events in different ways because their memory of those events becomes the glue to keep their identity together. And that is fine. In society, there is always going to be an emotional engagement with the past. There's always going to be a way history actually unfolded and how we remember the past. But that remembering is important as a source material, but is the historian's job to feed into the memory? No. Historians are engaged in a slightly more clinical affair, which is we are looking at what actually happened. We are not looking necessarily at what you think happened, what you wish happened, what is the better version that you want to put out there. We are going to look dispassionately at the evidence and say, these are the trends we are seeing. This is what actually happened. These are the sources we are dealing with. It's a very dispassionate affair, which is why, for the longest time, it used to happen in scholarly spaces, in universities, in academies, in classrooms, and so on. Whereas politics was sort of energized using emotion and memory. The memory of Gandhiji's sacrifices. Whereas a historian would look at Gandhiji much more clinically. You look at his racism in Africa, you look at his leadership, you look at the time he supported the British during certain wars, when he got the Kaisar-e-Hind, his experiments with his nieces, which was part of his experiments with celibacy. None of that is to judge Gandhi. Nobody's judging Gandhi. We're trying to understand Gandhi. There is the emotional side of Hitler, the terrible things he did. But scholars who study Hitler interrogate everything, his art, his sexuality, his military belief system, his political decisions, the challenges to him, do it in a dispassionate way because they need to understand how this man emerged on the stage at that particular time. So what's happened now, I think, is some of these boundaries have sort of collapsed, partly because of technology, partly because good history is going out to a lot more people. So there's this fear that somehow history in this dispassionate way, which de-romanticizes things, is colliding into the world of emotion, where communities are built, political narratives are built, political identities are built. When that collision happens is when politicians sit up and start complaining, saying, oh my God, these people haven't told us our true history. They've only told us about battles we've lost. Where are the battles we've won? I'm sorry, we're not sitting here picking and choosing which battle you lost and which battle you won. We're looking at all battles, and we're looking at what ended up having an impact on the country. So if someone themselves complains that Mughals came and invaded the country, obviously the focus is going to be on the battles that the people here ended up losing, which allowed the Mughals to enter the country. But now what's happened is some of those divisions have broken, and there is all-round confusion as to the role of the historian. I have my own emotional beliefs, I have my own political ideas, I have my own sense of religion and nationality and all of that. But does that mean that I will suddenly allow that to invade the way I do historical research? No. If you're a good historian, you try not to bring those two worlds together. So I can write dispassionately about religion, for example, but I can go to the Tali temple here with no contradiction in my head. Because I'm examining religion from a historical lens in my work, but my emotional connection to, say, a Shiva temple is a very different thing. When I walk into the temple, on the one hand, I'm looking, oh yeah, old, where are the inscriptions, all of that. But on the other hand, it's also connecting me in a different way to something else. And both are valid. I don't see why people have a problem that, with that division. That is one of the reasons why it gets politicized in this rather unhappy way.
Once again, there's a lot to get into there, right? Because I find it very strange when people say that, let's say the Mughals defeated us. Who is us? Because who are the armies that they were fighting? Who are the people who are being attacked? It wasn't you or me, man. It was some distant person who, to our ancestors, might as well have been living in a foreign country. This idea, as you pointed out, that this is us and this has always been us is a very modern process where, and you got to understand why it happened, right? 1947, 48, when you have this patchwork of like hundreds of princely states and people who have such diverse socioeconomic backgrounds and who come very often from backgrounds of oppression, who now suddenly have to form a democratic country with people who very often come from profound privilege, there is a need to find a single overarching narrative. So you're going to find these national figures like Ashoka, like Akbar, and you're going to say that, okay, so these figures represent what we think India is, right? But that's not the historian's job, as you pointed out. That is the job of the politician. And I think the danger lies when the lines between the authoritative speaker on history and the politician begin to blur. And that is a process that we're seeing happening at an accelerating rate today, where people who have little interest, let alone the training, in actually trying to reconstruct a well-balanced understanding of the past, these individuals who have very clear political agendas come out and say that historians are the ones who have agendas. It's actually the historians who are the enemies, because they aren't telling you things that you agree with. And I'm telling you the things that agree with, that support your biases, and that divert your political attention from issues that affect you onto people who existed hundreds of years before you. And you know what? If that is the goal, if we're really going to be going around correcting historical injustices, then why are we not talking about how violent Hindu kings were? The fact that that does not come up should be a very clear indication that there is clearly a political project going on in which the intellectual has become the unfortunate casualty, because we sometimes say things that aren't convenient to these unitary narratives.
In fact, when you mentioned this whole violence of Hindu kings, reminded me again of Martanda Varma, which again not many Malayalis know, but there are records talking about him plundering temples, seizing the gold, wanting to seize the gold. Some of it exists in oral narratives and myths. So the Panyanarkava temple, for example, in a place called Parimala, has a story about how Martanda Varma's soldiers came to the temple wanting to capture the gold and seize the gold, and how the Devi's power caused them to retreat. Now it's a myth, it's an oral narrative, but the legend is still telling you that they wanted to come and seize the gold. So there's that. There's actual Dutch records talking about churches being burnt, temples being plundered, Brahmins being lowered in caste. There were these Brahmin chieftains called Nambyadiris, and they were made to perform degrading tasks, and they would be lowered in caste and they would cease to be a political problem. This was a Hindu king doing all of these things, because where anyone got in the way of his power, it was power that prevailed, not necessarily religious sensitivities. But coming back to the earlier point you made, and I think it's time for audience questions as well, the job of a historian is not to give you fixed answers. The job of the historian is to pose questions and actually to make you think. It is perhaps the job of the politician and people speaking from other pulpits to give you one certain fixed narrative, saying, this is how it started, this is what it is, there can be no other way. So I think that's where the fundamental difference lies. We ask questions, we pose questions, we ask you to think and interrogate and apply your mind, whereas the other narrative is, I suppose, a bit of spoon feeding, saying this is the only way you can think, this is the only way the world evolved, there is nothing beyond this. If anybody says anything beyond this, there's some kind of conspiracy going on, and it's quite tragic.
I think the simplest way to put it is that all of us need to be historically literate. And I say this as an engineer who has become a historian and is sitting here talking about history. Historical literacy is important. Learning how to look at the past and how do you figure out what really went down, and what that teaches you about how we got here and where we might be going is crucial. And just to bring our discussion to a close, because I'm sure if left to ourselves, we'd probably just keep talking for about 3 hours. Just to bring that discussion to a close, I think the role of a historian is not just to write these highly nuanced discipline-specific histories, but also to teach historical literacy. And that is not just the duty of the historian, frankly, but the duty of all of us. If we want to be informed citizens who are able to make our own decisions about who we are, where we come from, and what we want to do with the power that we have as citizens, it is important for us to be aware of how histories are written. So on that note, let's open up for audience questions, and thank you all for sitting here so patiently.
Folks, the panel has only 10 minutes to take your questions, so please keep them short and succinct.
This is Vijaya. It's wonderful to see young men involved in something.
I'm sorry, we can't hear you. If you could just...
Sorry. Good afternoon. This is Vijaya. It's wonderful to see young men involved in something beyond the computer. Okay. Now, I have two questions, one for Mr. Pillai and one for you, Anirudh. Okay. For you, Mr. Pillai, today we're supposed to be a very open society, okay, we're supposed to be progressive, etc., and yet you brought out that we were more sexually accepting in the past than today. How do you think the transition took place? Okay, and for you, yesterday you mentioned that the Brahmins, okay, who are supposed to be the custodians of spirituality and education in our country, that they raped and plundered villages that didn't pay their dues or their taxes. I mean, how was this? I mean, I was a little shocked with that yesterday. Can you give me some, let's say, some archives that I can read up and understand a little bit more about it? Thank you.
On the sexuality question, I don't think we can categorically say that before it was wonderful and then somehow things have changed now. What we do see evidence of is that the kind of judgment that we bring to sexuality today was not what it is now. Again, one has to really contextualize and qualify. For example, the sexual autonomy of a courtesan, a Devadasi in the 18th century, would be very different from a Grihastha Brahmin woman. You know, that J. Devika makes that difference between the Kulastri and the Veshya. There was no moral judgment there. That was the Devadasi's word. She was a literate woman, a woman of means, a woman of education and knowledge, sometimes patrons of temples, patrons of poets in their own right, etc., etc. That was their world. But in a different circle, women might have a completely different space altogether. What happens, however, and what we know for sure, is that in the Victorian period, in the 19th century, there was a kind of internalizing of a lot of Victorian morals and values into our minds. As the famous cliche goes, colonialism isn't just about conquering territory, it's also about the conquest of the mind. It's also about constructing a mirror and telling you that this is your reflection. Somebody else has constructed the mirror, which is a slightly skewed mirror. We're looking in it and we think that this is our reflection. We're not autonomously, we haven't built that mirror. This is not our way of looking at ourselves. This is a way that was partly influenced from the outside and ended up having an effect on how we viewed ourselves, how we viewed what was good in religion, what was bad in religion, how suddenly temple cults that involved, say, animal sacrifice or non-Brahmin rituals suddenly became bad and only very esoteric ideas of religion became acceptable. Why is it that the class of people we call social reformers all spoke about Upanishads and philosophy? What about lived experience? I went to Srirangam temple the other day. There's a ritual, or was it at another temple in Srirangam? There's a ritual there where a man comes dressed as a woman. It's the Amman, but it's a man who actually wears the sari, etc. Comes, and there's a ritual around a cow there, and the people who gather for it, it's clearly some kind of old non-Brahmin ritual. It's still got space inside that temple. Suddenly that becomes something we don't talk about, and we instead speak only about the metaphysical, super philosophical things, because that is what Westerners have said is what religion should be about. Whereas for us, religion was a much more multi-layered affair. I could go to a Chatan cult, I could go to a Shiva temple, I could go to a Devi for something else. It was almost like a buffet. Much of that changes. It's the same gaze that comes to women's bodies and sexuality as well. And as I discussed in my first book in Kerala, this was particularly egregious in the way women's bodies were meant to be covered up after the 19th century. You know, the whole idea that women have to be taught to be chaste. Women have to be taught to wear blouses, because if you don't wear a blouse, it's considered bad. It led to some comical situations, like the Maharaja of Travancore ordering all his female staff to wear blouses. And they found it so awkward that the moment they left the palace gate, they throw the blouses off and go home, because no respectable woman would wear a blouse. A blouse was only worn by a woman who thought her body had something weird about it, or it was sexualizing her body. If you were respectable, you had no reason to do it. There are some misconceptions on this, that it was only lower caste women who were not permitted to wear blouses, etc. Not true. There's a photograph, Madamba Kunyugutta and his family, they're Brahmins, and you can see the generational shift. You can see the older Nambudri Brahmin women uniformly topless, the younger ones wearing blouses. Look at in Matanjeri, I don't know if the picture's still there, the Queen of Cochin in 1930 sitting quite topless and, completely unconcerned with it. Some of that changes because the gaze changes, and the Victorian period is, I think, critical to that, because we internalize the Victorian gaze about our bodies, about sexuality, about women's behavior, about men's behavior, all of that.
So to answer your second question about oppression, especially against violence against women, so there's two potential archival sources you can look at. The first is a little more nebulous, it isn't really collected in one place, but if you look at these fascinating objects called hero stones or viragals, So basically they're produced in this wide swathe of India from roughly Gujarat all the way down to Tamil Nadu. And they're basically stones that are erected when a warrior is killed. And the stone usually has a carving depicting how he was killed and a little inscription mentioning why he was killed. I think the vast majority of them are men who are killed trying to prevent the theft of cattle or the abduction of women. That in itself tells you the sheer scale of it. Then if you look at archival sources like the Epigraphia Karnataka, which collects vast numbers of inscriptions, and it's been digitized by the University of Tübingen, so you can look it up online, once again mentions, and it'll tell you the inscriptions and the year usually, and who was the person. So it won't be like a warrior always, but it'll be like a blacksmith's son was killed trying to prevent this rival village from kidnapping this and that woman. So the ubiquity of violence against women in medieval India it's difficult to put into words. It's just completely all pervasive once you begin to really look out for it. And of course that changes over time, and as Manu has pointed out, and especially for elite women, concepts of their own sexual liberty are very different from what would have been for low caste women. But I just want to add to, as a partial answer to your first question, this idea that progressiveness is defined only in terms of sexual liberty is something that once again comes from the West. The West thinks of liberty in those terms, but in India we actually have much more profound ways in which we are still very regressive when it comes to misogyny or caste discrimination. These are very much realities in present day India, and that's something that we've been struggling with for at least 1,000 years and are still working on trying to resolve. So I hope that answers your question. I don't think we have too much time, so I'd like to request that whoever asks us a question has try to keep it brief, please. You there, ma'am? One question, we'll just take one.
253I. Okay, I think 3 or 4.
Yeah.
Okay, this is a quick question. As historians, how would you like tests in history for students to be?
You answer that.
You wanted to change the narratives, you wanted better, to make history better. How would we test students in history if we wanted that?
I think one really interesting exercise would be actually to make it experiential. So you give them a bunch of sources from an imaginary history, right? So say, okay, so there's King so-and-so and he claims that he did so-and-so, but there's an oral resource saying so-and-so, so how do you write a history about that? Encourage them to be interdisciplinary in their approach, encourage them to read the work of previous historians, but not to hold them in awe, and to give them the freedom to interpret and tell their own histories. So I think that would be one interesting way to put it.
I think the essay format would be very useful. Instead of which year did Babur invade India, 1530, that's a very stupid way of doing history. Instead, write an essay about Babur, engage with the man, engage with his times, engage with his context, understand what the violence was, understand where he was coming from. Write an essay on it because it makes you think. The more you write, the more you think about something, you understand that topic better, obviously, instead of reducing it to answer this in one date or answer this in one line and that kind of stuff.
I think we only have time for one. No more questions? Okay. All right. Thank you all so much.